Today is one of those weird days in web development where a really unexpected thing happened. Nuxt Labs is joining Vercel. Too many triangles aside, this is actually a very exciting acquisition. The potential to benefit the web community as a whole is massive. If you're not already familiar with Nuxt, it is similar to Next.js with React. Nuxt is the Vue equivalent that goes a good bit further. It's just as much focused on the server rendering side as it is how data is passed, how you manage API calls, how you integrate different plugins and features, and so much more. It's somewhere between something like Laravel and Next, where it is a hybrid where it does a lot, but it's also relatively minimal and built with modern web tools. I've always had a good bit of envy for some of the cool things going on in the Nuxt world. Nuxt Labs is a company that was built around Nuxt, making the ecosystem for Vue and Nuxt as good as possible. They've also built some other very important technologies that we'll be touching on throughout this. This acquisition is a huge shift for Vercel and potentially for the web as a whole, because there's a lot of tech Nuxt makes that benefits people way outside of the Vue ecosystem. I'm really excited to dive deep into all the details here and how this impacts the web. Before we can do that, I need to cover some bills. None of these companies are paying me, so quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive right in. My team's been shipping more code than ever, and that's been awesome, except for two things. Our CI bill has gotten way bigger, and our CI times have gotten way longer. That is, until I checked out today's sponsor, Depot. They are a lifesaver for those teams that are trying to ship fast. They built a faster way to run your GitHub Actions, Docker builds, and more. And when I say faster, I mean like a lot faster. Their GitHub Action runners have 30% faster CPUs than what we have on GitHub, 10 times faster networking. The cache throughput's just insane, no concurrency restrictions, and the cost is half of the cost you would be paying GitHub for all of those benefits. I've known the Depot guys for a while. One of them actually helped design the original T3 logo, as unbelievable as that is, and now they're fixing Docker. They've always been huge nerds on making Docker actually performant, and getting container builds 40 times faster is just unbelievable. These boxes have so much CPU memory, and if you need AWS Graviton or Apple Silicon, they got you covered as well. Just look at the performance that these companies are seeing. Posthog, for example, has been building with Depot for a while, and they're 32 times faster for their Docker builds than they were before. If you want to be like this awesome set of companies and have builds going as fast as your team is, check them out today at soydev.link/depot. Nuxt Labs is joining Vercel. Let's dive in from here. I've got a bunch of other interesting details here to make sure we cover it from as many perspectives as possible. It's important to get this one right. From the start, our mission at Nuxt Labs has been to create the best possible developer experience for building fast and beautiful applications. We built Nuxt as an open source framework under the MIT license because we believed that great tools should be accessible, transparent, and community driven. This is an important piece. Nuxt itself isn't now part of Vercel. Nuxt Labs is a company that contributes to Nuxt heavily and also builds a lot of other tools in the ecosystem. They are the ones who are moving to Vercel. There are still core Nuxt contributors that exist outside of Vercel. It's still a community-run and community-driven project, but a lot of the tooling pieces that work around it are now moving into Vercel, which should hopefully accelerate their development and prevent any issues with funding, which could very well have happened when you're building an open source focused company. We've spent years pouring our time, energy, and resources into Nuxt, and through that, we've built not just a product, but also a community. One I'm proud of every single day. But sustaining open source at this level is hard. With Vercel's support, we no longer have to split our focus between maintaining Nuxt and funding its future. Now we can go all in on what we love, building in the open. Vercel has a strong history of supporting open source projects and creators. Next, TurboRepo, Svelte, ShadCN, AISDK, and more. They understand what it means to invest in the web as a shared platform. We're joining a company that shares our values and is helping us go further without compromising on what makes Nuxt special. Our open source team is coming along and will continue to work on Nuxt and Nitro with the same focus and care. This Nitro piece is important, remember that. The project stays MIT licensed, the roadmap stays public, the community stays at the center. With this, we're making some changes to how we handle sponsorships. All sponsorship funding will be moved to Open Collective for full transparency, as well as to ensure it goes directly to Nuxt core and community contributors. So what does this mean? Nuxt v4 with all Nuxt UI Pro components will now be available for free to everyone, as well as their Figma kit. Previously, one of the ways Nuxt Labs would make money was selling these pro components, which aren't just like UI elements like you think of components in React. They can do a hell of a lot more. That was previously something they would charge money for, similar to how Tailwind has the Tailwind CSS library you use, but also Tailwind UI, which is a thing you would pay for default starting points. That's one of the ways they were funding, as well as the Figma kit for combining all of this in Figma. They also are open sourcing a self-hostable version of Nuxt Studio, which is the server-side stuff that they maintained to make it easier to host Nuxt and keep track of what's going on in your deployments. They also are making Nuxt Hub agnostic to support other providers, integrate with Vercel's marketplace, with things like Postgres, Redis, etc. You get the idea. Looking ahead, AI will be a new area of focus for us. Very interesting. We're exploring how to bring AI into the Nuxt developer experience, helping you ship ideas faster. We're also working closely with Vercel's AI teams, including V0, and continuing to experiment with local tooling like MCP. Thank you to everyone who supported Nuxt along the way. Every contribution, bug report, pull request, and kind word has brought us here. If you have questions or want to join the conversation, Daniel Rowe has written about the future of Nuxt over on GitHub. We're still open, still shipping, and together with Vercel, we're just getting started. Thank you, Sebastian, for writing this, as well as Daniel Rowe, the fucking legend, pushing a lot of the important pieces that we'll be getting into. I love this little breakdown here with the thanks. Obviously, this will be linked in the description if you want to read it. It's all just on NuxtLabs.com. But it's really cool to see so many of the people who helped make this happen called out at the end here. Really good stuff. Crazy to think Nuxt started back in 2017 too. Crazy. The big obvious question is, why buy Nuxt Labs? And obviously, we're also concerned about what will happen to Nuxt and what do they mean by the AI bit. We're going to cover all of this. Let's start with a bit of a timeline. The history of Vercel, previously known as Zeit. Zeit was the original Vercel company. It was built to make deploying Nuxt easier. It was built by a bunch of the original creators and contributors to Next.js with the goal of making it easy to deploy those Next.js apps because a bunch of web devs suddenly building server-side code didn't know how to ship that. So deploying Next was made easier with Zeit. Next.js kind of started as like a default Webpack config for React and just kept going further, especially once the server rendering stuff and API endpoints and things were added, pushing Next really, really far. Slowly, Vercel got bigger than Next, especially once they made the move to serverless, which is also around where they rebranded to Vercel. Zeit was originally a easier way to host Docker images on real servers, and Vercel is what they transitioned to in order to make it easier to deploy and scale those things with serverless functions. The serverless function move made a bunch of changes, many good, many concerning, but overall, very nice change. This move represented a big industry shift, a change from servers to serverless for web deployments. That was a really powerful thing. And slowly, more and more technologies have been moving in that direction, as well as moving away from SPAs and towards server-rendered stuff. At the same time this was happening, a lot of other tools were making progress in various directions, including Vue. Historically, Vue itself has been really focused on the client-side experience, and not much of the Vue built-in tooling was ready for server rendering at all. And Nuxt was started seeing what was going on with Next and Vercel with the goal of making a similar experience for Vue. At the same time, there was a greater interest in a more batteries included way of thinking because Vue is a little more in that direction versus something like React, which is very much bring your own solution to problems or build it yourself if you need to. There's a spectrum to be thought about here, where on one side you have tools that don't do much for you, but are a good basis for building on top of, like React. And you have things on the other side that carry a lot more of the heavy lifting for you, like Laravel, where if you're adding auth to Laravel, you're using the Laravel package. If you're adding a KV to Laravel, you're using the Laravel package. If you're adding billing to Laravel, you're using the Laravel package. In React, good luck. You're doing all that yourself or pulling in your own solution. There's also Flask versus Django, which is where I originally learned this distinction. These are two Python server rendering web libraries, and they came out around the same time, and they were both most prominent around the same time. Flask was a much more minimal HTTP rendering solution where you just take a URL and return something, JSON, HTML, whatever you want. And Django is much more everything included. And I really liked when I saw these two options. It helped me understand the difference between these ways of building. There's also tools like Rails, obviously, that is in this general area. Things like Elixir and Phoenix. That's over here too. There's a bunch of stuff on this side here. One of the things that I think makes Nuxt so interesting is it's one of the very few things I would argue is in the middle here, where the pieces are still very primitive and you can build without them. You can bring in your own solutions. It's all still super modular. But at the same time, they provided a lot of good solutions that fit well on this side too. Meanwhile, something like Next.js on the Vercel side is a lot more over here. Stuff like server components and server actions pushed it slightly, but at the same time, those are still super, super primitive and you have to build your own stuff around them. As such, Next still is pretty far over here. And Nuxt in the middle here is very interesting. And I want to take this opportunity to talk a bit about the AI stuff. As we all know now, AI can build things decently well, but there's a couple problems I run into when I'm trying to generate stuff with AI, in particular, new projects. While AI is really good at scaffolding and setting up a new app, we've all seen like Bolt, Lovable, V0, etc., there are things it's bad at. Things like configuring auth, managing schemas for all your API endpoints, following lint rules, using the right solution in multiple places, not cluttering your app with use effect everywhere, etc. These are all things that AI is not good at doing. From my experience, the only AI app builder I've used that gets auth correctly more than a fourth of the time, I'm not exaggerating. I've basically never gotten most providers to get auth working when I'm on something like V0. It just works in Chef by Convex because I think they built it into the template, but that's the only one that's even come close. Managing schemas for all your API endpoints, database connections, all of that, total mess. A lot of this is handled in Nuxt with their $fetch helper. That is a type-safe method for hitting API endpoints. Really nice to have that built in. It's almost like they have a tRPC built into the framework. They have a bunch of awesome lint rules and things to keep guiding you in the right way that make a lot more sense, in my opinion. There's a prescribed right solution to a ton of problems in Nuxt, and there's a good default built in for most of the things you need to do. You can reach out and use other JavaScript libraries if you want to, but you don't have to, which is really useful, again, for AI, because if it doesn't know what to use, it can use the thing built in. But if it does know what to use, it can reach out and use that thing. And honestly, stuff like the use effect cluttering in your code base just isn't really a problem in the Vue and Nuxt ecosystems. They have a very different way of managing state that has its own negatives, but for the most part, keeps you out of that mess. There's a lot of things that Nuxt does that, in my opinion, actually make it a really good target for building with AI. And there's a chance that over time, the AI tools we're using to build apps are going to shift from preferring the things on the left to preferring the things on the right. I see a ton of reason why this would happen. And Nuxt is a really good, at the very least, in-between point, depending on where we end up as the tooling changes and as the AI stuff gets better over time. And if Vercel is currently here in this world with like Flask and Next, and it turns out the ideal range for AI is like here, they don't have anything in that space. The Nuxt acquisition gives them a point of reference to start moving towards these more inclusive tooling pieces. It's hard to know what bet will play out right long term. You can kind of think of this as a diversification / like hedging your bet type move, where if it turns out the more modular way of building that React and Next have is wrong, Nuxt can be a really good starting point to transition towards this more inclusive way of thinking and building. So to go back to the timeline here, Zeit became Vercel, started betting more on serverless. Next.js was the thing driving a lot of the development at Vercel, but they wanted to not bet on just the one horse. So they made a pretty crazy move. They hired Rich Harris. Rich Harris, if you're not familiar, is the creator of Svelte. Svelte's a really, really cool library. When I was at Twitch, people called me the Svelte guy because I was so hyped, not necessarily on the framework, but on Rich himself. If you haven't watched his talks, I highly recommend them. Computer Build Me an App is weirdly ahead of its time, especially now. This was a talk he gave in 2018, and it's so hilariously relevant now. It's hard to put into words. Rich is incredibly talented and thoughtful, and seeing him move to Vercel was very unexpected for me, but it made a ton of sense because he was at New York Times before, building the framework half in his free time, half to power one-off experiences in New York Times. And now he gets to just work on this framework that he cares so much about. Part of this move with Rich going to Vercel is that they started focusing more on server rendering stuff, both because Vercel is the place for server rendering, more importantly, because he felt like he had squeezed out most of the performance wins he could on the client side and wanted to start thinking more holistically about his application development. So this is when SvelteKit went from a thing being worked on to a huge focus of where Svelte was going. This has been awesome and has driven a ton of development, not just in the Svelte community, but in the full stack web development world as a whole. A lot of things that Rich and crew came up with in SvelteKit have started to permeate through the rest of the ecosystem, and it's been really, really cool to see. So this was the big diversification play that Vercel originally made. Instead of just betting on React plus RSC plus Next, they decided to diversify and make sure other potential solutions were not going to hurt them, but instead could drive development forward. And they also wanted to make sure that Vercel wouldn't just be the place to host Next, but it would be the best place to host web technology as a whole. Also worth noting that my introduction to Vercel was around this point, but I was not a Next.js user. When I started using Vercel, I was still on Vite and React, and this was really, really early in Vite too. We're talking like the first 2 months of Vite supporting React. I was on Vercel because it was the easiest way to deploy my web apps with CDNs and everything, with good developer experience, good CI, and all that just built in. And it was effectively free to do at the time because I wasn't doing any server rendering or anything like that. I just had static HTML it was hosting for me. Really convenient, really, really nice for that type of thing. Vercel quickly became a thing I loved when I discovered the /API folder. The /API folder let you spin up server functions without having to pick a specific framework. You could just put in a TypeScript file, export a function that takes in a request and returns a response, and Vercel would automatically turn that into a serverless function for you. So I could very quickly define a single page app with Vite and React, deploy it on Vercel, add this folder to the code base, put some random functions I need that hit the server on that, like database calls and whatnot, and then just ship it all and it would work. It was really, really powerful. That's how I built the original version of Ping called Round for doing collaborative calls with other creators. I very quickly ran into issues specifically around how many of those functions I was defining and how long they took to build and deploy because each one got its own Lambda. I learned that Next.js would collapse all of the endpoints into a single bundle and only have to deploy it once and route lots of different traffic to that same endpoint. That's when I moved to Next.js from Vite. It wasn't because I preferred Next. I didn't start with Next. I was on Vite for almost a year before I really caved and looked into Next more seriously. So even though most people think Next.js is the gateway to Vercel, for me, Vercel was the gateway to Next.js. And it's looking more and more like Vercel might also end up being the gateway for something like SvelteKit, or now something like Nuxt. But there's another gateway that we should be considering here. The same way that the API folder got me into Vercel and then into Next, V0 can do the same thing. V0 can get somebody into Next.js, or into Vercel, or into SvelteKit, or into Nuxt. These tools that help you build will make it less likely you're picking a technology, more likely you're picking to build a solution. And the technology is now just a thing that gets picked up along the way. With V0, the amount that Next.js matters to Vercel is fundamentally different. Next is just another building block, and I'm almost certain that Next.js is no longer one of the biggest drivers to Vercel. My honest guess is that it goes both ways, but something like V0 probably drives a lot more new traffic than Next.js does. So more and more, I think Vercel is realizing a framework doesn't matter much anymore. And instead of continuing to fight to make sure Next wins, their goal is to make sure the web wins, and Vercel is one of the most convenient places to build for the web, no matter what you want to build with. So with all of that said, how are we feeling about what will happen to Nuxt? This is a real concern people should have. When they see a technology they've bet really heavily on go through a move like this, it's scary. There's a couple pieces we need to be considerate of. First, Nuxt Labs is not Nuxt. The relationship between Nuxt Labs and Nuxt is not as tight as Vercel and Next. There isn't really Next without Vercel. It just doesn't happen. Nuxt Labs runs a lot of the Nuxt development, and a lot of the contributors work at Nuxt Labs, but they're just another seat at the table. They're not the owners of the whole thing. The point being with this is that theoretically, if it was to fail and go south, sour, whatever, Vercel owning Nuxt Labs does not necessarily have to impact Nuxt in any way. Right now, it looks like it's going to mean more funding and more time for the team to focus on Nuxt and the tools around it, but they don't own Nuxt. Vercel acquired Nuxt Labs, which means they acquired the developers who are largely the contributors to Nuxt, but Nuxt is still its own separate independent entity that Vercel does not own. Point 2, look at Svelte and SvelteKit. Vercel acquired them a while ago, and they are doing better than ever. The amount of progress they can make, the amount of focus they have on getting the framework to the best possible place, the ease of deploying it, the ease of working with it. Like Ben, my channel manager, is fully obsessed with Svelte, and I get it. It's a really cool framework that has made a lot of things that are not easy for us in the React world way easier. And there's a ton we can learn from Svelte, even if it's not the framework that we go to. But most importantly, with the money that Vercel gave the Svelte team, they could do crazy things, including grabbing Dominic Ganaway, who was one of the original React core team members, like helped drive React forward. Now he's one of the core maintainers for Svelte working at Vercel. That is a really, really cool thing. Arguably the most important piece, and I'm not saying this to downplay the other contributors and how important they are. I just think it's important that we shout out one important person. Daniel Rowe is still there. Daniel Rowe is one of the most kind and thoughtful people I've met since I started my web dev career, much less this whole influencer arc. He's one of the first guests I ever had on my stream. Every conversation I've had with him has been incredible. He's one of those people that makes me wish I was a Vue dev because he is such a good shepherd for the community. It's incredible. Daniel wrote a post on the Nuxt GitHub as the tech lead for a lot of the work going on there. And I think this has a lot of important details. Link in the description as always, but I just want to cover the most important pieces. Specifically, Nuxt's growth has been made possible by generous sponsorship from individuals, companies, and especially Nuxt Labs. Nuxt Labs, a company founded by Sebastian and Alex, are the original authors of Nuxt, have supported many people on the core team as well as others in the wider ecosystem. So again, Nuxt Labs is a company made by the creators of Nuxt, but they kept Nuxt separate intentionally. Nuxt has become really popular and it's being used by places like Google, GitHub, and Microsoft, and many more as well. Vercel has decided to bet on that future. Vercel's hiring several team members from Nuxt directly, as well as the entirety of Nuxt Labs, like @NuxtPy and Antfu, all of which we'll be talking about. In some ways, nothing is changing. As a team, we'll retain our independence, public roadmap, and open governance. I will continue to lead Nuxt's technical and strategic direction full time. And of course, our values and commitments remain unchanged. Nuxt will continue to be a community-built framework with the same team, the same vision, and the same values. We believe in the open web. And I hope you know that at the heart of Nuxt is choice. Choice in modules, databases, bundlers, routers, and of course, deployment platforms as well. But in other ways, lots is changing. Vercel's investment in the Nuxt team means that we will have more time to invest in making Nuxt better and empowering our community. It's a strong endorsement of our vision, and it will help us pursue it more sustainably. It will also mean that sponsorship we receive from the community can now support even more contributors. This is a big deal. If Vercel is paying all the ex-Nuxt Labs employees as salaried employees, any sponsorship to Nuxt can now be forwarded on to other contributors from outside of the company, which is really cool. All the money they were getting before can now be sent to the community, and Vercel could cover salaries for core team. And of course, Vercel can now be better shaped to work well with Nuxt and Nitro and all these other things. We have a lot to talk about there. Don't worry, we'll get there in a moment. But as you would expect, as a big fan of Daniel, I love this. Read it if you want to hear all the details. The future for Nuxt is bright. And we have people who aren't at Nuxt Labs but are deep in the ecosystem in here, like Alex Lichter, who's at Void Zero, the company that Evan Yu spun up for the Vite ecosystem. Daniel Rowe still being involved means there's little no risk of this going bad. And Alex Lichter shouted that out and says 100% agree with 3 as a core team member. Yep, you'll see most of the Vue community is fully aligned. You'll see nothing but kind words about Daniel, one of the most positive people I've seen. The way I'd put this, imagine if Kent Dodds was a core contributor to Next.js. Yeah, he was the CTO of Nuxt Labs. He is a really positive driving force. And honestly, I'm excited about what it means to have somebody as thoughtful and positive and technical as him inside of Vercel. I thought that he was the CTO. Was he not? Thanks for the correction, Alex. I mentioned that Daniel Rowe was the CTO. Thought he was. Sounds like he wasn't. My mistake there. Regardless, was a big driver for the Nuxt project and making sure as much could go in the right direction as possible. And the whole UnJS world is really good. And some of the people from that are making it over as well. One of my personal favorites, somebody that I've benefited a lot from the work of historically, Antfu is now at Vercel. That is huge. Anthony Fu is one of the most important, behind the scenes people in the modern web. The amount of random things he has built is insane. We use a ton of his stuff for T3 chat because his syntax highlighting is absurdly good with Shiki. You've probably used things he has built in the past. You'll probably use more in the future. He's incredible. One last thing to know about the Nuxt stuff is important. Every Nuxt Labs dev is coming over. Sometimes with these acquisitions, especially if it's a low valuation or a Hail Mary play, they'll lay off a bunch of the team during the transition or during the acquisition. That did not happen here. Everyone working at Nuxt Labs is now going to be at Vercel. And that is huge because the Nuxt Labs team is pretty small, but has some of the most talented people in the industry, as we'll be talking about momentarily, because we still have to dive into Nitro. Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, the main reason I'm optimistic about the Vercel and Nuxt acquisition is how they've treated Svelte since acquiring it. They do the same for Nuxt, which they claim they will, and I believe they will. Then I think this is a net positive for Vue and Nuxt users. Absolutely agree. And you see here a bunch of people who aren't necessarily the biggest Vercel fans, like Josh Manders, my top reply guy who went from hating me to homie. Josh Serre here, who is big on the Laravel world. I love Josh, by the way. He's incredible. Check out his channel if you're into the PHP stuff. He's great. But You'll see a lot of these people coming in. I agree. Trust Vercel to do this. This isn't as scary as it might seem. And I understand the fear and reservation, especially if you bet on Vue and Nuxt because you didn't like the vibe from the React and Next.js world. This is really scary. But I think it's also really promising. We got one last important piece to talk about that I've been intentionally punting till now because I wanted to cover the Nuxt side. But there's one other very important technology that comes as part of this. We need to talk about Nitro. Most of you have probably not heard of Nitro. That's a really good sign because ideally, if Nitro does what it's supposed to, you will not see anything about it in your tooling. But a lot of the tools you're using are powered by Nitro. Jared called this out in his announcement when this acquisition went through. Nuxt has played an enormous role in shaping the modern web. Having the Nuxt, Next, and Svelte teams collaborating under one roof is going to be amazing. For me, though, an equally exciting aspect of this acquisition is the Nitro JS Dev server framework. Not only is it wonderful for building backend services and APIs, it's also perfect for MCPs. I expect Nitro to play a key role in Vercel's transition to full stack and AI cloud. This is a particularly interesting thing for Jared to call out because he's leaving Vercel. He already announced it. He's leaving soon. He drove a lot of the work for V0 at Vercel. So he doesn't have a big stake in making this type of claim anymore. This is his, as far as I could possibly guess, his honest take on things. He seems to be genuinely really excited about Nitro. Oh, he's already ex-VP. Yeah, so Jared's already technically gone. So he's just saying this now as an external. So what is Nitro? First off, I need to follow Nitro. Nitro is a next-generation server toolkit. It's part of the UnJS tool set that Puya, Pi0 here, is the lead builder and maintainer of for the entire web ecosystem. Both UnJS and Nitro are incredible, and we'll get to all that in a minute. I'm mostly familiar with Nitro from Solid Start and Handstack Start, heavily using it for dealing with the server-side parts, server rendering, API endpoints, all of that. Obviously, it's also core to Nuxt. This is a really big play for Vercel to have Nitro, because Nitro is how a significant portion of non-Next.js frameworks are built, and it should be maintained well. In order for Next to have good competition, Nitro needs to exist and thrive. Historically, Nitro has been in the middle of a decent bit of drama, not because it's bad in any way, shape, or form, but because it's in such a valuable position in your stack, where it's like somewhere between the framework, the runtime, and the data layer. Like, Nitro is one of those technologies that kind of exists here, but also exists here. Like, it owns the whole thing to an extent, and it puts it in a weird spot. It means that, like, a lot of decisions have to be made in how it integrates, how the DX is expected to behave, and all these parts. And Nitro went a much more minimal approach, which, as you know with me, I really like and respect. The key, though, is that it didn't do everything, so other pieces were spun up, the biggest one being Vinxi. Vinxi was originally built around the needs for Solid Start so that Solid Start could have all the parts that it needed to be successful. It was broken out to be used for other things, including React and server components, and it was a core dependency for Handstack Start. Slowly, Vinxi has gotten less well-maintained. The dev, despite being incredible, just is distracted by other very exciting tasks. He's one of those like super devs that chases the things that excite them. So Vinxi, both because it's like a really obnoxious and in the weeds problem to solve, and the goalposts are shifting constantly, and it's not super fun to work on, I'm sure, slowly has been phased out, and Nitro has been taking more and more of the work that Vinxi used to do by wrapping Nitro. So I think we've established that Nitro is important, but let's hear it from Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid. This is pretty huge when you consider that Nitro powers Nuxt, Solid Start, Handstack Start, and Analog.js, adding that to its existing funding of developers working on Next and SvelteKit. Basically, every meta framework except for Astro, Remix, QuickCity, and Fresh now has its core being developed by devs under Vercel. It's something to think about. Yeah, but at the same time, a lot of these projects are being steered externally. As everyone's favorite XKCD, Nitro's always been here to an extent. And I get the fear that Vercel owning 3 of these blocks for 3 different stacks, like, that's a reasonable thing to be worried about. Like, if we have Next.js, the whole thing is owned by Vercel. They're like all of these little pieces are theirs. And with SvelteKit, they go out of their way to have as few of those types of dependencies as they possibly can. I would argue that this image is kind of cropped due to the nature of how they are thinking and building for Svelte. Like all their core depths are part of Svelte, and they're going out of their way to maintain that. I've never seen people get so upset that a dependency changed its subdependencies as the Svelte team, and for good reason. They want their stuff to be simple. So next, Svelte, and now, of course, Nuxt, Analog, Solid, Start, etc. These have always been built on top of Nitro, which is one of those small depths. The only thing that changed here is that now we went from Vercel controlling this to Vercel now controlling this. But I'm also intentionally using leading language here. I said control. That's one way of viewing it. The other way of viewing it, and the way I honestly do think of this, is not as Vercel controlled. I think of this as Vercel funded. I would honestly make the argument that before this move, Nuxt was in semi-mortal danger because this dep down here required Nuxt Labs to make money. And that is a scary thing to depend on. This small dep has its own deps, and one of those deps is being funded. If the random person in Nebraska isn't paid enough money to work on the thing, then the thing dies. And the really cool thing that comes with this acquisition is a much more secure source of funding for the building of Nitro. That's a very good thing to see. While I understand the concern that all of this is controlled and funded by Vercel, my counter argument would be that Vercel is much more securely funded than a lot of the other places that these could have got their money from. SvelteKit and Svelte were not particularly core to the business of New York Times. The likelihood that those were maintainable long-term without somebody like Vercel helping fund the development and pay the workers for it is very low. Same deal with Nuxt and the whole Nitro ecosystem. There was a very real existential risk that they could run out of money and not be able to do it anymore, and people like Pi would have to go get a different job and not be able to work as actively on these things. All of this said, anytime you have one of these blocks in your stack, there is an existential risk. You have to consider that going in. Whenever you're building on something that has a piece that you don't own that is important, you need to know that you have control over this thing, and that if it does fail or stop being maintained or bus factor hits, you have to be prepared accordingly. And a lot of people are doing that prep now, including Tanner. Nitro is a very valuable tool, and we will continue to support it as a build adapter for TanStack Start 1, but it will not be a hard dependency. We've been working for a while now towards Vite native to support any Vite plugin that uses the environment APIs to configure build output. Tanner's dropping this because he was concerned about questions people had about Start because Nitro is made by NuxtLabs and NuxtLabs is now part of Vercel. This is not a bet against Nitro so much as covering all your bases to make sure no one thing can tank something as important as TanStack Start and all of the work that Tanner's been pouring in. The way I would put this simply is, how do I turn my TypeScript files into a real running service? All of the stuff that we have built in the bundler world has been focused on shipping to the client, to users. Things like Webpack, things like Vite, things like Snowpack, for those who were here for that. Most of these tools were focused on how we take the giant pile of JavaScript and TypeScript and dependencies that you installed and all these things and turn them into a bundle that you can ship down to the user. And even fancy things like bundle splitting. So different routes would get different bits of JavaScript. So if you have one page that needs a ton and one page that doesn't, you're not loading too much. You get the idea. Stuff like tree shaking, all the fancy things that make our bundles good largely come from this fight on how to bundle our JavaScript and TypeScript. Notice that not a single thing I said there mentioned Node or the server-side code. All of those tools have historically been very much focused on the client-side JavaScript experience. And if you want to build for the server, you'll probably just compile the TypeScript into JavaScript and then call Node the name of the file, and then it runs and you're fine for the most part. But that's not as reliable when you want to do different things, where bundle splitting does matter, like in serverless functions. You're not spinning up a Docker image with all of your code and serving all your requests. You want different images to spin up as fast as they can when a request comes in on a serverless node. That's a thing that requires a standardized build and bundling process. The most important detail here, though, is that that bundle process is different from the client-side bundling. So if you want to have one code base with one packaged JSON file that has server-side code and client-side code and bundles them and puts them in the right place so they work properly across different providers, be it a Docker image host or Vercel or Netlify or Cloudflare or setting it up yourself on Lambda, all of these different paths require a build output that can be shaped and used for those different platforms. In the build output wars, are a quietly brewing thing that most of us have not seen much of. Vercel was one of the bigger players here with the Vercel Build Output API. If I recall, that was what it's called. I don't know if it still is. I haven't kept up with this stuff very well. But a big part of what made Vercel so nice to deploy on is they standardized what this would look like. So if you had your own framework you were building from scratch, they would show you this syntax, this format with the Vercel Build Output API. And as long as you followed that standard, your bundler would spit out code, you would hand it to Vercel during the build process, and now it's deployed and just works. But that's one of a handful of standards. Thankfully, Vercel has been relatively open with the build output API, and as far as I know, they wouldn't go after anybody for replicating this for their own service. I'm not positive about that, but I would be surprised if they did. The optics would just be terrible for them. But it's one of a couple different options. You could make the argument that Nitro was kind of a competitor here. It was a different way of thinking about your build outputs. There's also the adapter way of thinking. This is how a lot of different frameworks would work. Something like Remix. If you wanted to use it on Cloudflare, you would install the Cloudflare adapter. If you wanted to use it on Vercel, you would install the Vercel adapter. And these adapters would take the output from the framework and make sure it was in the right shape for the right thing, because none of these tools have a standard shape for that backend stuff. On the web, you have to shape your bundles the way the browser expects. On the server, shrug. There's a lot of different ways it can go, many of which are great, many of which are not. Vercel built a pretty good standard, and I've talked to a lot of framework maintainers that were impressed at how reasonable the Vercel build output API was, but they weren't building to it directly, they were building with Nitro. And one of the cool things that happened a week or two ago is that Vercel officially announced that Nitro apps would automatically work with zero configuration on Vercel, because they worked hard with Nitro and with Pi0 here, our friend Puya. They worked really hard to make sure this ecosystem of tools would work on Vercel. And Vercel's goal here, to be clear, isn't to be the only place you deploy stuff. It's to make this part easier, to standardize enough of like the shape that your server-side TypeScript comes out in, so that all new tools and solutions will be very easy to deploy on Vercel and theoretically easy to deploy other places as well. This is an underrated part of this battle, and I'll also argue that the Vercel build output API is too low level for any normal person to think about, especially a normal dev. Nitro is an abstraction slightly higher that makes a lot more sense. To think of these in layers, you have the node runtime. On top, you have the output shape. So in this case, it would be the Vercel build output API. Then you have something like Nitro on top. Then you have something like Vinxi potentially on top as well, if you want to bring in more of the client and server relationship part in the server rendering as well. Then you would have the meta framework on top, something like TanStack Start, something like Solid Start. And then you have the client side code stuff on top. But more importantly, you have your actual code. So when you write code in a framework like Solid Start, it has to go through all of these layers before it gets to that server side node runtime. Vercel owns this part because it's theirs, but also it's a standard. Nitro is an important piece to get there that makes a lot more sense to build stuff on top of. So now let's talk about MCPs. MCPs are a thing I have intentionally dodged talking about for a while because honestly, I just haven't seen many really compelling use cases yet, but it's starting to happen. MCP is the Model Context Protocol. It's meant to be a standard for telling an LLM how to interface with something. It's important to know that MCPs, it lets your AI check your database for values. It lets your AI look things up in documentation. It lets your AI access stuff that it traditionally couldn't, unless it like browses the web, and AI is not very good at that. It's meant to be a standard for how AI can interface with other things. But a lot of those things require it runs code on a server, which means to make a good MCP, you have to bundle TypeScript so it runs well on a server. If you're outputting that directly to Vercel build output API, good luck. Nitro, as Jared said, is very promising if you treat that as the point where you start or target your actual MCP code. Instead of having to handle the bundling yourself to make sure it fits the shape Vercel expects, you can just npx nitro init and have a good starting point. It's still crazy that something as low level as Nitro has an init so you can start a new project with it, which is super, super cool. Similar to something like Next, it has a shape for how you're expected to structure things with routes, API directory. You get the idea. It's an easy shape for file-based routing to use to define APIs, endpoints, and whatever else you need to, and deploy it wherever you want to. And I'm honestly really excited to see what Nitro looks like with both access to Vercel's huge network of super smart people, as well as proper funding. I am as hyped, if not more so, for what this means for Nitro as what it means for Nuxt and the web as a whole. I've never gotten to see Puya with this level of support, and I am really, really hopeful that more of Vercel opens themselves up to working with him because he is a very smart and thoughtful person that has the potential to build pieces that are huge for the web going forward. It's a bold statement, but in a lot of ways, I do think Nitro could be the new Express, the starting point for building server-side TypeScript code. And the potential there is nuts. Funny enough, normally I read chat, come up with ideas for statements to make. I actually thought that before I saw you say this, Alex. But yeah, I'm happy we're on the same page there. Nitro has so much potential from inside of Vercel that I'm really, really excited. And God, I hope Vercel doesn't fumble the bag here. I'd be surprised if they did. It's too valuable for them to do it, but there's a huge opportunity for success here. Alex from Void Zero also jumped in and made a really important distinction and call out that there's a Vite plugin for Nitro coming. So that in Nitro, you can use Vite as the bundler, builder, and all the pieces you need to glue it all together. And that's very, very exciting as well. Vite's gotten a lot more thorough in the full stack view with the new environments API. I think I did a video on that forever ago. But the tooling here is improving at a rate I never thought I would see. And it's really, really been cool to watch. And the idea of having so many powerhouses in this space working together with the goal of just pushing the tooling forward is genuinely really exciting. One last hot take, because this is a thing that I've been thinking about. I might even do a dedicated video later. This is our last chance to unfuck developer experience. I've been thinking about this a lot. As these AI tools and building solutions get more and more prominent, things that our existing tools do are going to become more and more cemented into the way that we build. If we don't make use effect better now, it will never happen. If we don't fix the way that we output our builds and our TypeScript bundles, they will never happen. If we don't make TypeScript faster, it will never happen. The benefit, as well as the negative with AI, is it makes reproducing existing ways of doing things absurdly cheap. So if we don't improve the way we do things right now, there's a really scary possibility we never get to. The analogy I often give for this is roads. Once we picked a width that a road would be, we could no longer justify making cars wider than that or in a shape that doesn't fit on those roads. Because once the infrastructure is laid, changing it becomes really, really hard. Historically, the browser was the thing that had those standards that wouldn't change. They might add new things, but they can't change anything that websites might be using. AI is kind of doing that now to our tools. Historically, the framework and language layer is where we could innovate, and we would bundle that into a shape the browser would understand and use. We've moved up a layer due to these AI tools, and I'm scared if we don't fix things here right now, we might never get to. And what's exciting about this play by Vercel is they are going to be investing heavily in fixing as many things in these layers so that the code we write or have AI write on top is simpler and, much more importantly, way more maintainable and understandable. I'm scared that if we don't do it now, we might never get to. And I'm thankful that Vercel isn't just assuming we're stuck where we are and investing in all the AI stuff. They're actually investing in these core tools that AI will be building on top of in order to make sure they are in as good of a state as possible as more and more of our work is automated. I'm super excited to see where this all goes. I'm generally pretty confident in the direction that Vercel takes acquisitions like this. It's basically unheard of that they buy a project and just kill it. They usually help fund it and see it to success. I'm very excited to see long-term where this all goes. And honestly, I'm just pumped to know that all of these awesome developers are being compensated fairly and consistently for the important work that they're doing. Quality meme. Let's end on that because this is a really, this is a good vibe. I'm pumped about this and what it means. Having so many awesome people under the same roof, building together, pushing forward together. It's really exciting. Appreciate y'all a ton. I hope you're as excited as I am. Let me know what you think. And until next time, peace nerds.